series, which is sponsored by Irish Aid, the Irish government's Programme of International Development Cooperation. This is the first event in the 2026 series. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Celeste Saulo, who's the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. Dr. Saulo has been generous enough to take time out of her very intense schedule to speak to us, and we look forward very much to what she will be saying. Before I formally introduce her, I would like to hand over to Nuala O'Brien, who's the Irish government's climate ambassador, and who will make some opening remarks on behalf of Irish Aid. Nuala, over to you.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for joining today. I'm really, really honoured and delighted to welcome you to the first of the 2026 Development Matters lectures delivered by our partner, IIEA, and noting that we're actually in the 14th year of the series. The Development Matters series is a hugely valuable forum for Irish Aid and for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, providing a really important space for us to convene global experts and thought leaders to share their knowledge and their insights on key development issues, and equally gives us an opportunity to share some of our work with a much wider audience than we would normally be able to talk to and to reach. So I would like to thank Alex White, the Director General of the IIEA, and Jill Donoghue and her team for the excellent work that goes on into the organisation of this lecture series. Personally, I have to say I'm very excited by today's topic. As a humanitarian and disaster risk management practitioner for over 30 years, I've seen firsthand the difference that data-driven early warning and early action makes. So if I look to Mozambique, for example, where I worked first when I worked overseas in the late 1990s, and then again I worked there more recently. Recently there was a cyclone in late 2025 called Cyclone Ditwa. Decades ago, such a storm would have meant the loss of lives and the total devastation of crops, livelihoods and homes without any warning. This time, however, thanks to the cross-border data sharing and the community-led early warning systems, the farmers received an alert 48 hours before landfall. Those 2 days allowed the community critically to secure their equipment and their homes, move their families to the designated shelter, and protect the seeds. Really importantly, protect the seeds for the next planting season. They didn't just survive the storm, they preserved their livelihoods and remained resilient. This is how science and innovation can translate into human dignity, resilience, and economic stability as well. So today's seminar is all about scaling up these success stories to every corner of the globe. And Ireland, we remain committed to this path, doubling our international climate finance to 225 million euros annually as of 2025 to support those on the front lines, focused in particular on the least developed countries and the small island developing states. So to lead our discussion today, we're deeply honoured to welcome the World Meteorological Organization Secretary General, Dr. Celeste Saulo. Shortly after I commenced my job as Climate Director in Irish Aid, I met Professor Saulo at COP30 in Belém, Brazil, when our Minister Neil Richmond, Minister for International Development and Diaspora, was announcing additional funding to the Systematic Observation Funding Facility, a World Meteorological Organization fund that Ireland has had the pleasure to co-chair with Professor Saulo last year. The World Meteorological Organization is a valued partner for Ireland. In the period when climate records continue to be broken on an almost monthly basis and extreme weather events are multiplying in frequency and severity, Ireland remains committed to the United Nations Secretary General's Early Warning for All initiative. We understand that for millions of people globally, the difference between a close call and a catastrophic loss is not just luck. It is data, it is information, it's a text message, it's a radio broadcast, or a community leader with a plan. As climate-driven extreme weather becomes our new reality, the transition from simply reacting to these disasters to building proactive, science-led resilience is one of the most vital missions of our time. This information provides support to the most climate vulnerable communities, wherever they are in the world, in the developing countries, in the developed countries, and it helps communities to prepare, adapt, and ultimately save lives, livelihoods, culture, and biodiversity. So I look forward to learning from Professor Saulo how the global public infrastructure coordinated by the World Meteorological Organization underpins weather, water, and climate intelligence worldwide, enabling early warnings that protects lives, livelihoods, and economic stability. So again, thank you all for joining today online, and I would now like to hand you back to David, who will moderate today's event. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Nuala, for those remarks. And I must say, I thought the Mozambique example was particularly interesting. And thank you very, very much for that. That really got us directly to the heart of this discussion. So we will now hear from Dr. Saulo for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will go over to Q&A with our audience. You'll be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see on your screens. Please feel free to send in your questions or comments throughout the session as they occur to you, and we'll try to come to them once Dr. Saulo has finished her remarks. A reminder that today's presentation and the Q&A are both on the record. Please feel free to join the discussion on Twitter, excuse me, or X, using the handle @IIEA. A few words first about Dr. Saulo herself. She is a native Argentina. She's, as Nuala said, a globally renowned meteorologist, the first woman and the first South American to be appointed Secretary General of the WMO. Dr. Saulo began her 4-year term of office on the 1st of January in 2024. Prior to this, she served as the Director of Argentina's National Meteorological Service, and she was the first Vice President of the WMO. She graduated from the University of Buenos Aires in 1996 with a PhD, and she rose to a full professorship there when she became the director of the Department of Atmosphere and Ocean Sciences. Her own scientific specializations include numerical weather prediction, data assimilation, short to medium range prediction, and early warning systems. So with that, I hand you over to Dr. Saulo. Celeste, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, David, for this kind introduction, generous introduction, and also for this invitation. And for me, it's a pleasure to address this audience on the aspects that we will now present through the title of my slides that is coming up through the screen, hopefully. And I would like to address this topic today, from early warnings to lasting resilience, but with a special focus on development and supply chains and how they depend on invisible infrastructure. I would like, together with you, navigate these complex interactions between what we feel and are exposed to on an everyday basis, which is the weather and the development agenda, and also the productivity in general of countries, regardless of their level of development. So although WMO, as you mentioned very clearly, is the agency that is the United Nations specialized agency on weather, water, and climate, I will navigate this lecture from a development perspective, and then I will end up with a weather climate perspective, just to embrace the interest of a wider audience. So next slide is aimed at just using, in a way, your own memory, your own history, which is well known to the world, and how Ireland was affected almost 2 centuries ago by one of the worst famines that we can think about. When unfortunately, approximately 25% of the population was lost because of this famine. Of course, a famine is not cannot be related to any single factor. We all know that the biological component had a role. The capacity of institutions and anticipation in those days was very limited, very, very limited. And of course, climate did its part. So I would say that Ireland learned from many years ago at a very high cost, I believe, that food systems are closely linked to climate systems from the very basics. And again, I want to emphasize that it's not only one-to-one. There are many issues related, but I want to, of course, highlight that linkage. So in the next slide, I would like to move to food as the first global supply chain. What do I mean by this? So food is at the core of one of the things we want to make sure that is available for our population and for the broader population. And I will use the linkages between weather and food. That, as you can imagine, and I'm sure that the audience is well aware of the connection between weather, climate, the crops, the type of crops, whether they can grow well, the productivity, and so on, and then the production of food, and then the impact on society. If you see weather there, and you know I'm coming from the World Meteorological Organization, you can imagine that I will concentrate on that piece of this value cycle or supply chain, but always telling you that the weather and the climate have connections and interlinkages, not only through the crops, but also in the food production and the food distribution and the food consumption, if you wish, if we speak about, for example, water. But at the same time, we are speaking about development and the strong role that Ireland has in support of the least developed world on the small island developing states. 70% of the world's most vulnerable populations depend on agriculture. That's why I'm trying to put this example of food production at the core of this message. And at the same time, this vulnerability is not only because the level of development is limited, it's also connected with a great exposure to hazards and great exposures with very limited resources to cope with those hazards. And unfortunately, also, these climate hazards hit food systems first. Let's think about a drought. Let's think about flood. In general, they affect people directly and their productivity and their livelihoods almost as directly as they do with people. So this is the first aspect I would like to highlight. And when I speak about weather, I would like to put all of us at the common stage. What do I mean by weather or weather intelligence, as it has been mentioned by Nuala Ambassador. When we speak about weather, we speak about three main pieces. One, data. We need data to understand what the weather is now. Data is the basis to prepare good forecasts. So the second element we need is forecast, because we need to anticipate what will happen. And we cannot do anything with data and forecast if we don't know how to relate this information to decision making. So it's not only about what the weather likes, as we like to say, but what the weather will do, how the weather will impact my particular activity, how the weather will impact people, their security, their safety, and or their productivity. So going to weather in the next slide, I'm just highlighting some weather climate related information that really allow decision making, support decision making. So when we speak about food production, we speak about the need of having seasonal forecasts, 3 to 6 months in advance to know what will happen worldwide. At the same time, we need drought monitor systems. We need to know where scarcity will affect and how it will affect different communities. And on the other extreme, we need flood warnings. We need flood warnings, and these are just examples of tiny little amounts of information that the meteorological services provide nationally, regionally, and globally in a way that we believe supports those that need to take action. So that's why at the bottom of this slide, I'm speaking about forecasts to provide elements for anticipatory action. Forecasts themselves mean nothing if you don't ingest this information into the decision-making process. And that is where I want to put a lot of emphasis. So we are not speaking about abstract science. With this information, farmers decide when to plant, how to plant, and how to prepare. And governments decide when to intervene if necessary, if they have a drought monitoring that alerts them. And then markets decide prices. So there are millions of euros in place at the same time that nature is driving weather. And that is something I think we need to think collectively how these pieces interlink. So I invite you to reflect on the following aspects that are highlighted in my next slide. How these products, and when I say products, I mean forecast products, data derived from meteorological observation or observing systems, including satellites, how these products leverage to enable early action. That is one question. The second question I would invite you to reflect on is what is happening in the developing world? Does the developing world have access to the same amount of information that the developed world? Is it enough? Is it close to be enough? Is it too far away from their needs? And how does WMO help to address the capacity gaps? So before moving into the next slide, I need a few seconds from your thinking just to reflect a little bit on this. And of course, I'm sure you can imagine that there are huge asymmetries in the world in terms of how they can access to weather and climate information. First, the data. Second, the quality of the forecasts. The forecast cannot be better than the data that is ingested into the forecasting systems. So it's a close connection there. So if you don't have enough data, the forecast probably will be weaker in the I would say the global south than it is in the developed world, where the information is more dense. And even if we speak about satellites, satellites cannot solve the lack of surface data that are taken by national meteorological and hydrological services. So these are the elements I want to bring to your attention, and at the same time, bringing your attention to what's the role of WMO. The role of WMO is we do not produce forecasts. We do not do the observations. What we do is to collect, to coordinate, to share, to standardize, to put normative work in a way that everyone has access to the highest quality and the highest amount of data possible. And with this, we hope we can enable different countries to develop their own capacities. And I will use the same example that the ambassador mentioned in terms of Mozambique, because certainly it's a very nice example to showcase the importance of global cooperation, national engagement, and science and innovation. So in my next slide, I will move to Mozambique and how they improve their early warning system. And the example that was provided by Nuala clearly depicts how Mozambique did a great job in the last, I would say, 10 years. And Mozambique, as you can see here, is a country extremely exposed to natural hazards. And on your left, you will find the type of natural hazards they are exposed to. Most of them floods, followed by storms, then droughts, then landslides. Landslides usually are associated with heavy rains, continuous heavy rains that create landslides, and wildfires that usually are related to droughts. So I would say everything, all the disasters in Mozambique in the last 40 years have been related to essentially weather and climate. And because of that, Mozambique is ranked as the third most vulnerable country in Africa for weather-related disasters. But as the ambassador noticed quite well, Mozambique is a great example of resilience. They were severely damaged by a tropical cyclone many times, I would say, from 2007 to 2014, and they started to prepare not to be surprised again by a tropical cyclone. By the way, tropical cyclones are being more frequent in this region of the world because of climate change and trends. So what we need to understand is that first, there are critical observational gaps in Africa in general and in Mozambique in particular. So we need to recognize these gaps in observations. There are also gaps in capacity because you need, as I mentioned before, more observations, ingest them in strong forecast systems. And so Early Warnings for All is an initiative that is globally driven, but has helped Mozambique to identify their gaps, establish a roadmap, and now having in place a new forecast system that is fully based on what we call impact-based forecast, in particular dedicated to floods, because floods are their main concern. So impact-based flood warnings that currently are available in Mozambique are the result of global cooperation, national engagement, WMO coordination mechanisms, UNDRR, other agencies of the UN system, ITU, Red Cross, and several players that really played together to be in this much better position that they are now. So this is a successful story about how we can collectively address an aspect that now is not completely based on the support received from other countries, but it's also combined with Mozambique government's priorities in terms of increasing their capacity. I would like then to move to the next slide, because I spoke about food systems at the very beginning of this talk, but I would invite you and I would invite you to consider if you can think of any activity in any modern supply chain that is not affected by weather or climate. And I'm sure that you will not find any activity. So what we see currently is that the same logic that we could apply to food security can be applied to all advanced economies and every single industrial process, from transportation, from industries, from logistics, green energy, whatever you can think of. It's modified, affected, impacted by weather and climate, in particular extremes weather. And I will also use an example that maybe it's also more linked to Ireland economy. And it's in the next slide. For example, the industrial supply chains that are connected with the pharmaceutical sector. You are pretty very strong country in your exportations are important in the pharmaceutical industry. It's a very strong industry that relies on many things. As I mentioned before, I'm not expected to be an expert on everything. I will put the emphasis where I want to put the emphasis. But in this industry, precision, timing, and stability matter. And it is a very complex, it's a complex line. But I would like to draw your attention into the interconnectivities of this industry with what happens in other parts of the world. So in the next slide, I would like to invite you to consider the storyline of the pharmaceutical industry. Where does the industry begin? And 70% approximately of the active pharmaceutical ingredients are produced in Asia. So you don't have monsoons in Ireland. You have monsoons in Asia. And what's happening with the monsoon? How you can use a seasonal forecast to see in advance if the monsoon will be stronger or weaker, or if it will move more to the east or the west. Typhoons also affect Asia, not Ireland. But in the end, this is a very complex industry that is relying on what is happening across the world. So it's a production that is energy and water intensive, and it's exposed to disruptions of many kinds, including climate, logistics, energy. And these disruptions upstream of this value chain, of course, can halt downstream production. So I think this example is quite evident for those that are producers, are economists. They have this very clear in their minds. I'm not so sure if they do understand the silent infrastructure of weather and climate information that lies behind the support of this huge, impactful industry. It's a global network of information that underpins the success of this important modern industry. And I would like to highlight that. So my next slide is a replication of the hidden value chain that is underpinning the success of any productivity or supply chain. And this is where WMO stands. The system behind the system. It's the connectivity between 193 countries all over the world that at the same time are making observations, are through their national meteorological and hydrological services. That data is exchanged on an operational basis. So now millions of data, as I speak to you, are being exchanged under this system. And thanks to this, we have the availability of very good global forecasts that then are translated into even better national and local forecasts. But here is where WMO is. But this infrastructure is not so evident for the billionaire productivity business case that I mentioned before. And that is why, for me, it's important to address an audience like yours. Because we need to take, to understand and also to take collective action on something that is a public good. But it's not, it's given for granted. but it is not granted. And that is what I want to highlight. And at the same time, it's not granted, and it's unequally resourced, as you can imagine, in the least developed world, in the small island developing states, and even in the developing world, it is under-resourced. And there is where WMO needs to act, and where partnerships like we have with Ireland are so important. So I will give you the next slide to have an idea of what does the observing network look like. And this is a very updated map from the last year. And to showcase that the development gap is also an observation gap. Let me briefly walk you through the colors of this figure. When you see blue, everything is okay. It means that the global basic observing system is okay. The country is compliant with the global basic observing system. If you move from blues to light blue, it's okay. But as soon as you start to move towards the pinkish or reddish colors, it means that the global basic observing system is well below what is needed. And you can see there at a glance that Africa and many places in Asia and Southeast Asia are well below the needs to make sure that they have what is needed to secure the quality of climate information, and to make sure that the quality of the forecast is as good as possible, as good as science allows. And as a side note here, you can see that in particular, when we speak about vulnerability and exposure and safety, the mortality due to disasters related to natural hazards in least developed countries is 2.5 times larger than the global average. So there is a close correlation between this and what is happening in terms of the impact and vulnerability. And here you can see Africa and many goods start their productivity chain, their supply chain in Africa, and many goods start the productivity and supply chain in Asia, or Latin America. So please pay attention to this, because what is happening in this part of the world is weakening the risk management of the productivity in the global north. So if you go to the next slide, it's a packed figure. Don't pay attention to the details. But in the previous figure, I was trying to highlight the number of observations that we had at the station points, those observations that are done by meteorological services. But WMO also coordinates observations that are taken in different ways. These observations look like flight routes, and actually they are flight routes. The many air companies share the data that they take during the takeoff and during the flight, and then when they land. And this data is relevant for the forecasting system, for the global forecasting system. So this needs to be collected and shared in a common format. And again, here is where WMO has a role to make sure that this information coming from airlines is available to improve the quality of the global forecast. Again, you can see a great asymmetry here between the global north and the global south. So this is a pattern that, regardless of the observing system, you will find. So there is a risk in here, and an inherent risk in the supply chain of many goods, because of the lack of information in many parts of the world. So there are initiatives in place. We are very proud of them. And I would like to start with the next slide to highlight one of those, which is an initiative that the ambassador mentioned is well supported by Ireland. And thanks to your partnership on this. It's called the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, and it's aimed, as you can read there, to support countries with the most severe observation gaps. Prioritization on least developed countries and small island developing states. So far, 150 millions have been pledged to SOFF. 12 countries funded SOFF. Ireland was a chair in the last year and is actively involved, and more than $10 million have been deployed to this initiative by Ireland. So what does SOFF do? I would like to highlight very clearly. Supports the basic infrastructure at the national level to make sure that the observational gap is reduced. That is SOFF. Then we have other initiatives, and the example is CREWS on the next slide. CREWS is most on, I would say, the last mile. What does it mean, the last mile? And as I mentioned at the very beginning, you need data, you need forecasts, and you need to translate those forecasts for decision making. CREWS is more on the translation of forecasts for decision making. Again, concentrating in the least developed world and the small island developing states to create the capacity to translate the global forecast into something that is actionable for their communities, for their vulnerable communities. Again, multi-year projects, many countries, 75 countries so far being benefited by this initiative, 134 million US dollars, and many people being benefited thanks to this initiative. But then I have a few slides to end, and I want to highlight what is still missing between the basic observing system that we mentioned and we need to put there and the last mile. And what is still missing is that the global system needs sustained care. As I mentioned before, if the data is not placed into the common good and shared, it will not benefit the global good purposes. And so that is where WMO core business lies. And what is missing? Stewardship. What I mean by stewardship is recognizing that some systems are so fundamental to development and stability that our responsibility is to sustain them. And something that was born when WMO was created was born by and supported by countries. Currently, as you can see, not all the countries can do what is needed to maintain this global public infrastructure. So we are aiming at making sure that businesses and economic partners and member states and the private sector and the philanthropists understand that this is a very fragile infrastructure of data and forecast that needs to be guaranteed for the other businesses to really be successful. And that is why we created, on the next slide, what we call the WMO Commons, which is for us the logical next step. That is to make sure that we are able to sustain the critical infrastructure we are speaking about, protect its integrity, the neutrality, the trust, the availability, and to ensure its continuity, regardless political changes, regardless crisis regarding climate change. Regardless of whatever happens, we need to make sure that this is available, is strong, robust, and serve the purposes of the global common good. So that's why we launched last year the initiative of having the WMO Commons. And the next slide showcases how we envision to support what we believe is the logical next steps, and also combines perfectly with SOFF, which is the first mile, CREWS, which is the last mile, and this that is the global component. And it has four pathways. As I mentioned, the global backbone is make sure that data is available, is shared, is improved, sustained, and optimized, what we call the pathway 1. Then there is another pathway 2, also related to the global bone, strengthening global data interoperability and prediction, make sure that the global forecasts are shared and are available for those that they need to make decisions. And then the actionable part of things, the anticipatory action, the enablers of the anticipatory action, which are to expand the high impact services and early warning systems, pathway 3, and the pathway 4 is the capacity and user co-creation, because in the end, as I mentioned, every single productivity chain has its own storyline and has been constructed and supported from the beginning to the end. With that, colleagues, I thank you very much for this opportunity to address you. And back to you, David.
Presentation, which is thought-provoking and raises a lot of important questions. I really found it wonderful. There are a number of questions which I hope we'll be able to get to in the time available. Can I just begin with one of my own? You rightly, I think, present the work of WMO as involving a global public good, that you are in effect providing infrastructure and support which every country in the world must have in a kind of a universal and open way. But is that narrative or is that presentation catching on? I mean, do you find that governments are accepting that it is a global public good and has to be treated that way? I mean, I think we in Ireland would be very sympathetic to that, but I'm just wondering, are you getting a response internationally to presenting it that way?
Well, I think that there is an understanding that is a global public good, but sometimes this understanding does not necessarily translate into the concrete action that the country must take to make sure that it behaves as a public good. In terms of, for example, maintenance of the observing sites, making sure that infrastructure is up to date, investing in this system, and at the same time investing in WMO, which is the other point, because as you can see, and I was aiming at provoking a little bit your thoughts. The very important industries in one country depend on something that is completely far away of their own capacity to manage. So you need to make sure that there is, in this case, an organization like WMO that does its work, does its job. You know, we need to make sure that the developed world has the tools they need, and the developing or the least developed world have the infrastructure they need to make sure that they all benefit from the same thing. And sometimes governments do not really resonate with that, or do not see it as an obvious aspect.
Yeah. Thank you, Celeste. I have a question from Emma Richardson, who's a researcher at the IIA. Emma points out that trust is essential in warning systems. How does the WMO safeguard scientific credibility and data sharing in a rapidly evolving information landscape? I suppose there are many questions around how to protect the integrity and reliability of the data you have. So what is your response to that?
Well, certainly this is a very relevant question, and the systems that WMO supports are in a way designed to make sure that they are robust and reliable and operational 24/7. And that is a key aspect behind this. It must be 24/7. And that's why the global cooperation, again, is crucial, because WMO is not an operational agency. We rely on national med services, which are operational agencies, to make sure that every player has a role, and and there are backups in cases of possible failure. You can have a failure always. So that is the role of WMO, to connect those and protect the information. And we have teams of experts coming from all over the world that discuss the ways, the best ways for business continuity, for data protection, and for data availability.
Thanks, Celeste. I have another question here about the overall funding position for WMO in the current difficult environment for multilateral cooperation. In particular, what impact has there been from the radical reduction in the funding for NOAA? That's the American Weather and Climate Intelligence Organization.
Well, so far, NOAA is a very good partner of WMO and of the world community, I would say. So I think they've been handling the internal issues in a way that has not impacted the data sharing principle, the satellite data availability, and the global forecasts that they provide and share openly with the world. So that is so far is working okay, and I think it's very important to keep that alive, to keep that active, and recognize the important role that US and NOAA in particular plays in this field. That is very collaborative with other big players we have in the world. But as I said, this is a global infrastructure. Whenever one piece falls or is threatened, the others are exposed in a way or another. So that's why I also push for a collective understanding of the importance of every single player to maintain this system robust.
Thank you, Celeste. Another question here is related in some ways. Obviously, you're trying to build long-term resilience, but funders will often focus heavily on the short-term costs of providing the technology or providing the infrastructure. So is it difficult for WMO to keep the attention on the long-term resilience aspect, especially now when budgets are under great pressure?
Yes, I think it is difficult, and that's for me why it's important to have this kind of conversations with different audiences, because it's difficult because it's given for granted. When you use your telephone for a very simple kind of information every day, and Ireland is very famous for how much you care about weather. It's I would say impossible for you to know that there is a huge amount of efforts that are put in place to make sure that every single individual has that product at his or her hand. So it has been given for granted, and we've been silent for many, many years because we were not working for the headlines. We were working for the global public good. But nowadays, global public good are always at risk, because sometimes they are at risk. And that's why I believe it's so important to recognize that very productive and rich industries depend on something that is extremely fragile. And maybe it's peanuts for them to support that, but they don't understand that how it is important for their for their own benefit. So I think that we need to build that case clearly.
A further question, Celeste, would be what potential is there for private sector investment in this work? I mean, and how can you ensure a return on their investment?
Well, certainly, I would say that the principle of return of investment has been shown in many areas. And approximately, we know that for every single dollar you invest, you may get out of 10 or 20. It depends on the type of business on investment. But again, it's sometimes it's not so directly linked to I will put 10, I will put 1, I will get 10. It's about what you avoid to lose, how you de-risk your investment. It's about understanding the game in a different way. De-risking your investment is something that gives you strength and is it's very I would say profitable. But you don't know sometimes how to de-risk. Well, climate information, climate intelligence, the risks many investments. So it's not a linear equation. You put X, you get Y. It's not like in a bank. But I think we need to make sure that without data, you cannot protect people. Without data, without shared data, because again, the quality of forecast in Ireland is quite high, but your economy relies on the quality of forecast on the other extreme of the world, where maybe the quality is not so good. So how you can put that in your assessment of business productivity and business continuity in a way that you make sure that your investments take into consideration this risk and how to de-risk. That's why the WMO Commons, for me, is a good opportunity for the private sector to invest in something that will return certainty and de-risk their business.
A question, Celeste, from Ciarán O'Donoghue, who is a researcher at the IIEA. What would you feel are the most critical investments that the LDCs and the SIDS need in order to close the gap that you were talking about?
I would say that certainly the observing system is critical for them, but not only the land observing system. For small island developing states, I would say the ocean observing system. If you imagine an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, let's put it Vanuatu or Tonga or any of those, they are isolated tiny points in the middle of huge ocean. If you don't have good observations in the surrounding oceans, they are essentially blind to what will happen to them. That is on the short range, I would say, scales to make sure that they have, again, better forecast at a very high resolution for their small continental areas or land areas. But also the sea level rise. Their exposure to sea level rise is huge, and there we need more than just observing systems. We need to complement that with understanding and with resilience, and that is part of a much more complex environment, like the one of the famine in Ireland. Is not one element, many elements that are negative that combine, and we need to work across all of them.
Thanks, Celeste. A question here about emerging technologies. What role do you see for AI in terms of the impact it can have on WMO's work?
A lot. Actually, it has a strong impact. Now, for example, most of the global centers that produce forecasts provide machine learning models that provide forecasts that are almost the same quality as the traditional dynamical models. So AI is fully immersed in what we do, from data sharing, from data gathering, also for overlapping different kinds of data. And as you know, machine learning and analytics helps you combine these data sets in a way that makes sense for you to get more information, actionable information. So AI is part of every single part of the value chain of the meteorological side, from data to forecast to translation of forecast into actionable information.
Celeste, you've been very, very generous with your time, and I think we can manage maybe two more questions there. They're quite small. One is, what role does local knowledge or traditional knowledge have in assessing climate risks?
A very significant role, and I'm quite proud to recognize that there are many efforts, and in particular in our case through CREWS initiatives that work with small populations where you can reach out to this indigenous knowledge, because they understand very well the impacts, and they also understand how to be resilient. So it's about combining their knowledge with what science also can contribute, but in a very combined way. It's necessary to bring that knowledge at the same level, because they have the same level, and also because an early warning system will not reach people if they are not reached in a way that is understandable and resonates with their cultural values, with their way of thinking, and the local knowledge becomes a kind of crucial. I would say early warnings for all depends crucially on local knowledge.
Well, in fact, the last question that I have, Celeste, relates to the Early Warnings for All initiative. What's your assessment of the progress that it has made so far?
It has made incredible progress, and I would say that the main progress has to do with being so evident that the world needs this tool for better adapting. And that is kind of a very clear call. It's a call to action to countries, to UN system, and brings a clear action where you can anticipate to something you cannot change. So the hazard is there. What can you do? Well, prepare in advance to protect your people, to protect your livelihoods, to do something. So it's very clear, and it's a place where everyone can do something. So it has to be improved, of course, but it's possible. It's not so difficult. So we must improve the early warning system across the world.
Thank you very, very much, Celeste. That was really a terrific Q&A session, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of everyone for your initial presentation, the slides, and thank you also for the focus on Ireland and the relevance of what WMO is doing, for example, to our export performance, or the impact it has. So you've been a wonderful guest. We've learned a huge amount. There's a lot to follow up on, a lot to reflect on. You've given us a number of questions to think through. I found particularly interesting the links between weather and development, between climate forecasting and the achievement of development objectives, including the SDGs. And I know that is central to your work. I don't speak for Ireland, but I know that we value greatly the work that you do at WMO, and I'm personally very pleased to hear of the support that we've given so far. And I look forward to further interactions between you and the IIEA. And I really would like to give a very, very warm thank you to you for the time you made available, for the generosity with which you took the questions just now, and for a really, really fascinating account of what WMO is doing. So our very, very best wishes for the future.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the audience. My pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Celeste. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.